First of all, I want to thank all of you brave people for being here this morning. Given that I always say we want people to feel better for having been here, coming to a service called Lamentations is a true act of faith. And I think it's a sign of wisdom. As poet Khalil Gibran wrote, "Keep me away from wisdom which does not cry, the philosophy which does not laugh, and the greatness which does not bow before children." So wise ones, today we are considering the wisdom in expressing sorrow, both the private griefs of our lives and the collective grief and despair we feel about the state of the world. In our story this morning, the woman found that every household in her village had been touched by sorrow. And this is true here. Each one of us has experienced deep grief, death, divorce, addiction, disease. You name it, someone in this room has lived it. Each of us may also have experienced grief from social and ecological shifts, a childhood home bulldozed away for new development, a beloved landscape now barren, or experienced losses caused by politics, losing one's birthplace forever because of war, denied rights because of unjust laws, and reading the news, looking at the rise of right-wing dictatorships, the wealth gap, the climate crisis, the spread of COVID-19, the fight for Indigenous rights. If you pay any attention at all, it's hard not to worry about what the future might look like for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. We live in an age of sorrow, and we all suffer. The first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is suffering, and the Buddha wasn't wrong. Life is suffering on many levels, from the physical to the spiritual, and we can't avoid it. Jesus agrees with Buddha. As a religion that truly took hold when it was embraced by slaves in the Roman Empire, Christianity tells us that we are born into original sin, born broken, born suffering. And there is power in this spiritual truth, that to live is to suffer. It resonates with those whose lives are a struggle to be themselves and to be free. And religions that speak to pain, acknowledge suffering, can tend to people's deepest needs. Unitarian Universalism is just learning, I think, how to speak to suffering. We grew as a religion in North America at a time of great innovation, from electricity to penicillin. So it seemed that there was no problem humankind could not solve. And so in 1886, Unitarian minister James Freeman Clark identified 5 points of new theology for Unitarianism. And the last one was the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. And while Reverend Clark was acknowledging that onward and upward forever requires an effort to achieve, it's really not a theological stance that offers much at all to the people standing under that rocket blasting up. And history shows that while there have been amazing accomplishments in the last century, they have come at a very great price. And progress can always be lost. We live in an age of sorrow. Now, onward and upward forever was an instrumental force in Unitarianism. We are a religion of optimism, but we're learning to temper that with a more grounded sense of humankind. Our theology calls us to affirm that we are born whole and holy, but wholeness is not perfection. To be whole and wholly human is to also be broken and suffering. Each of us, while being our wonderful whole selves just as we are, carries aching hollows of pain within that wholeness. Think of a homemade loaf of crusty sourdough bread. Sometimes when you open it, there are large bubbles of air, gaps in the wholeness of the loaf, but they lie unseen until that loaf is opened. We can be whole and hollow too. And Unitarian Universalism says that while we are born whole, born into possibility, not sin, we say to live fully is to embrace the light and the dark. That night of cruel weeping destined for me. No one cares for my soul. I can't do it, not today. Laments give voice to universal sorrows. The goddess expresses the helplessness of the people of as their city was invaded and taken over by another nation. David was on the run for his life, crying out in fear and isolation. And Nancy was weeping for all the injustice in the world. Helplessness, fear, sorrow for self and others. I have felt all of those feelings in my life, sometimes all at the same time, which leads to a lot of ugly crying. I'd rather not feel them, but I have learned over the years the only thing worse than feeling all these feelings is not feeling them at all, because that's how you end up like Douglas Copeland's character. I seem beyond being able to love. I don't think any one of us wants to be beyond love. We have to feel all of our feelings, experience all of our suffering to be fully human and to be wholly ourselves. The dark night of the soul is part of the human experience, and unfortunately it's one we have to experience over and over again in our lives. To be human includes time for lament. Lamentation is an acknowledgement that things are not as they should be, not as we wish them to be, that sometimes life is pain. It's an honest expression of vulnerability, and it's an energetic outpouring in the end. It's a release. Writer and activist Parker Palmer says that in a period of heartbreak, he was finding that tears were coming easily to his eyes. And at first, he tried to avoid the tears and he sought distractions. And then he tried to go with the grief as it rose within him. And then one night, the floodgates just opened, and the rush of grief was greater than all the grief he'd felt so far. And eventually, after sobbing for a time, he stopped and went to bed exhausted. And waking up in the morning, Palmer felt a peace that surpassed all understanding. We avoid the pain because we believe we will be overwhelmed by the feelings, that we might be broken beyond repair by the storm surge. And the truth is sometimes we are overwhelmed. The pain can be too much to bear in that moment alone. And that's when we need others, when we need God or Spirit or whatever you call the life force on earth, or just other people in your life. There will be times when we need help, when we need others not to cheer us up or to fix us, but to hear and witness our struggle and just sit with us in the pain. We need to know we are not alone, that others have been in that dark place too. And it can be hard to ask. It's hard to be seen in the midst of struggle. It's ugly and messy and snotty, and no one cries prettily except in the movies. So it's embarrassing. But after the ugly crying, after the overwhelm, after sitting with people who love us, we do all eventually arrive at the other side, to peace, calm and clear as the blue sky. If, as a religious tradition, we say we are here to experience all of life, the highs and the lows, that means we have to be here for the ugly crying too. We are stronger together when we help one another. And I think as a tradition, we're still figuring out how to embrace that bleaker, harder side of life. We have our joys and sorrows, that weekly ritual which invites you to share your feelings. It's intended to be a place where you can name your struggles in a place of safety in front of others, to be heard and seen and know you are not alone. We have a ritual of remembrance each fall where we honor those who have died. We've held informal sharing circles in times of crisis. But I do sometimes wonder if it's enough, given this age of sorrows around us and our preference for hope and optimism. And I sometimes think enviously of older tribal cultures where public mourning was normalized with professional mourners. Women who would come and wail and weep and pull at their hair and beat their chests in acting out the grief of the family. Sounds cathartic. And it meant that families weren't alone in their grief. It didn't leave grief to be private. It was shared by others and expressed in public. Perhaps we all need more public displays of sorrow. I think I'd appreciate having professional mourners at protests who beat their chests and weep loudly for all the species we've lost, for all the people dying due to starvation. Mourners who refuse to deny our collective sorrow, who make us acknowledge it. Dressed in full-on funeral regalia, I expect they'd get some notice. They'd make some space to breathe. And so here in the years to come, I hope that we find more ways to honestly acknowledge life's lamentations together. Collectively lament life's struggles. And we're also struggling just experiencing our own sorrow. Wisdom comes when we stop running from our pain and sit with it instead. As Unitarian Universalists, we're asked to honor all of our feelings, and so it might help to write or sing or pray your own lament, to express yourself through words. If you're an artist, painting a picture may help. Lighting a chalice and meditating on the flame can help ground us when we're experiencing difficult emotions or difficult times. Talking to a close friend or family member, someone you trust to listen and acknowledge. You can talk to me when you're in trouble. And in the days to come, I invite you to consider your understanding of sorrow. What were you taught as a child about suffering? And what wisdom have you since gained? Do you have things in your life that need to be lamented and honored? Life is suffering. This is a noble truth, the first noble truth for Buddhists. It is the beginning of wisdom. For people of the chalice, it is not our fundamental truth. It's only part of it. We say, yes, life on earth is suffering, and it is more than just suffering. American poet Louise Bogan says, I cannot believe that the inscrutable universe turns on an axis of suffering. Surely the strange beauty of the world must rest somewhere on pure joy. Unitarian Universalism would say, yes, life is suffering and life is joy. Yes, and sorrows and joys. Writer Barbara Kingsolver says, I've come back from despair by forcing myself to look hard for a long time at a single glorious thing, a flame of red geranium outside of my bedroom window, and then another, my daughter in a yellow dress, and another, the perfect outline of a full dark sphere behind the crescent moon, until I learned to be in love with my life again. Like a stroke victim retraining new parts of the brain to grasp lost skills, I have taught myself joy over and over again. When you are in despair, come here on a Sunday and be held in the glorious music, or look up and out at the glory of the birch tree. We all have to learn to weave sorrow and joy into the garment of our lives. And this chalice community is here to help, to give you room to experience the grief and to help also find the joy. Activist Joanna Macy says that the pivotal point in her life came when she learned how to dance with despair. Macy says, we are called to not run from the discomfort and not run from the grief or the feelings of outrage or even fear. And that if we can be fearless and be with our pain, it turns. It doesn't stay static. It only doesn't change if we refuse to look at it. But when we look at it, when we take it in our hands, when we can just be with the pain and keep breathing, then it turns. And it turns to reveal its other face. And the other face of our pain for the world is our love for the world, our absolutely inseparable connectedness with all life. I love this image of caring tenderly for our pain and grief, holding it in our hands until it reveals its other face, love. Expressing our grief, releasing our despair, allows us to return to loving the world, to loving ourselves, to loving others. The light and the dark, the pain and the love, sorrows and joys, it's all connected wholly and whole. May we learn how to lament, to express our grief, to face our pain, and find its other side, love. Life is suffering, yes, and so much more. So say we all.